Jack, Trip. Callahan wasn't used to having a good day, but this was something else. After a disastrous wormhole jump, he crash-landed on Astrolith, a fractured planet of floating islands, neon chaos, and deadly creatures. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding a beautiful, winged alien woman, Lyra, waiting for him in a glowing, sacred pool, her power as otherworldly as her beauty. And when danger closed in, they had no choice but to fight side by side. A stubborn human and a starborn siren. Together, they would stand against the dark forces hunting them. Will Trip survive the chaos, or will Lyra's mesmerizing power pull him deeper into her world? The battle has just begun. Love epic sci-fi adventures with a dash of romance? Hit subscribe for more thrilling tales like this one. Don't miss a single adventure. Jack Trip Callahan was having the worst day of his life, and that was saying something for a guy who'd once set his own boots on fire trying to impress a Martian barmaid. His junker ship, the Rusty Tick, had just miscalculated a wormhole jump, spiraling out of control toward Astrolith, a fractured planet of floating rock islands and neon-lit chaos. The control panel sparked, sirens wailed, and Trip, strapped into the pilot's seat, slammed every button he could reach. "Come on, you rusty bucket, don't die on me now," he yelled, voice cracking as the ship plunged through a shimmering void. The impact came fast, a bone-rattling crunch as the Rusty Tick smashed into a jagged island of black stone, its edges glowing faintly with veins of pulsing blue light. Trip's harness snapped loose, hurling him face first into the windshield. "Ow, my beautiful nose," he groaned, peeling himself off the cracked glass. He stumbled out of the wreckage, dragging his battered duffel bag, his patched-up spacesuit wheezing like an old accordion. The air outside buzzed with strange vibrations, thick with the scent of ozone and something sweet, like overripe fruit. All around him, Astrolith unfolded in surreal splendor. Floating islands spun lazily in the distance, connected by shimmering bridges of light, while neon-bright trees pulsed like living lanterns. Trip barely had time to gawk before the ground trembled. A swarm of crystal-winged bats, each the size of a hawk, their bodies glinting like shattered glass, swooped from a nearby grove. "Oh, great, killer disco balls," he muttered, fumbling for his gear. His translator, a clunky box clipped to his belt, crackled to life, but instead of warnings, it spat out, "Hey, sexy, want to share an asteroid?" Trip froze, horrified. "Not the time, you glitchy piece of junk." He yanked out his homemade flare gun, loaded with a jury-rigged canister of flammable goo, and fired. A glob of orange flame arced toward the bats, exploding midair in a dazzling burst. The creatures screeched, scattering, but not before a stray spark landed on Trip's pants. "Whoa, whoa, no," he yelped, smacking at the growing flames on his thigh. He tripped over a glowing root, tumbling head over heels down a shallow incline, cursing all the way. "I didn't sign up to be a human barbecue." The fire fizzled out as he rolled to a stop, sprawled in a patch of soft, luminescent moss. His chest heaved, sweat beading on his forehead, but a grin cracked his dirt-streaked face. Still alive? Take that, universe. He'd always been like this, too stubborn to quit, too dumb to panic. Back on Earth, they called it grit. Here, it was just survival. He hauled himself up, brushing off his singed suit, and squinted at the horizon. The island hummed beneath his boots, a low vibration that tickled his spine. Somewhere overhead, a bridge of light flickered, casting rainbow shadows across the stone. Trip adjusted his duffel, muttering, "Okay, new plan. Find shelter, don't die, maybe flirt with something that doesn't want to eat me." His translator chirped again, "You look radiant tonight," and he smacked it with a groan. "Shut up. You're embarrassing me in front of the bats." The air shifted, a sharp whine cutting through the hum. Trip spun around, catching a glint of movement in the neon grove, something fast, something angry. He tightened his grip on the flare gun, heart pounding, and took a cautious step backward. The moss squished under his boots, releasing a puff of glowing spores that danced upward like tiny stars. Whatever was out there, it was closing in, and Trip's gut told him his day was about to get a whole lot weirder. Trip bolted through the neon grove, his boots slipping on slick, glowing roots as the whining sound grew louder behind him. He didn't dare look back. Those crystal bats were probably regrouping for round 2, and he wasn't about to become their glittery chew toy. Stupid planet, stupid ship, stupid me, he panted, dodging a low-hanging branch that pulsed pink and green. The grove opened into a shimmering cavern, its walls jagged with crystal spikes, and Trip skidded to a halt, nearly tumbling over the edge of a drop. Below, a cascade of liquid light poured into a pool, sparkling like molten silver. He caught his breath, muttering, "Okay, that's pretty cool." Then he saw her. She rose from the pool, water sliding off her in rivulets of radiance, and Trip's jaw dropped so fast it nearly hit the ground. Lyra was a vision, tall, over 6 feet, with a body that screamed perfection. Curves so sharp they could cut glass, hips swaying like a pendulum, chest rising and falling with every breath. Her skin gleamed like pearl, shifting with rainbow hues under the cavern's glow, and her hair floated around her like a nebula, strands of starlight rippling in the air. Massive, translucent wings stretched from her shoulders, quivering with a soft, musical hum, and her hands flexed, revealing delicate, metallic webbing between her fingers. Her eyes, huge and star-filled, locked onto him. No pupils, just endless constellations. "What are you?" she demanded, voice sharp as a blade. "That dares spy on me?" Trip blinked, brain short-circuiting. Fan MMO, he stammered, stepping forward, and promptly tripped over a crystal shard. He lurched toward her, arms flailing, and his hands slammed in her waist, fingers digging into the cool, smooth curve of her hip. The sensation hit him like a shockwave. Her skin was firm yet yielding, like polished stone warmed by some inner fire, and a faint vibration buzzed up his arms. He froze, palms still pressed against her, heat creeping up his neck. "Oh crap, sorry, my hands. They've got a mind of their own." Lyra hissed, wings snapping wide with a sound like chiming bells, but she didn't pull away. Her starry eyes flickered, a mix of fury and something else, curiosity, maybe? "Remove yourself, flesh thing," she snapped, but her voice wavered, and Trip caught it. He straightened, reluctantly letting go, though his fingers itched to linger. "Flesh thing? Ouch, that's cold. Name's Trip, by the way, Jack Callahan, but Trip's what sticks when you crash as much as I do." His translator buzzed. "You're a cosmic dream, babe," and he smacked it, mortified. "Ignore that, it's got a crush on you." Lyra tilted her head, wings humming louder, and took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the crystal floor. Up close, she towered over him, her scent like stardust and honey, intoxicating and alien. "You intrude on sacred ground," she said, circling him like a predator. Her hair brushed his shoulder, sending a shiver down his spine. "My kind, the starborn, do not suffer trespassers." Trip grinned, scratching his scruffy jaw. "Yeah, well, I don't suffer staying in one piece either, but here we are." He gestured at his singed suit, the tears exposing glimpses of his lean, scarred frame. "Crashed my ship, got chased by glitter bats. Honestly, you're the best thing I've seen all day." Her wings twitched, a ripple of light dancing across them, and Trip couldn't tell if she was annoyed or amused. He took a chance, stepping closer, boots crunching on the crystal. "Look, I'm not here to mess up your glowy bath time. Just trying to survive." His hand brushed her arm by accident, or maybe not, and his fingers slid along the webbing between her knuckles, cool and silken, sparking a jolt that made his breath hitch. She stiffened, but her starry gaze softened for a split second, like she'd never been touched before. "You're bold," she murmured, voice low, almost a purr. Trip smirked, heart racing. "Lady, you've got no idea." A sharp screech echoed from the grove outside, cutting through the tension. Trip spun, flare gun raised, as the cavern walls pulsed with a faint, ominous glow. Lyra's wings flared, casting shadows that danced across the pool, and she moved to his side, her shoulder brushing his. The air thickened, the hum of Astrolith growing restless, and Trip tightened his grip, ready for whatever was coming next. The screech from the grove hit like a punch, a high-pitched wail that made the cavern's crystal walls shiver. Trip whipped around, flare gun trembling in his grip, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Sounds like the glitter bats brought friends," he muttered, squinting into the neon-lit shadows beyond the entrance. Lyra's wings snapped wide, the hum rising to a sharp, defiant note as she stepped beside him. Her shoulder grazed his, sending a jolt through his battered suit, a fleeting tease of her alien warmth against his skin. "They found us," she said, her voice tight, starry eyes narrowing. "My kind won't tolerate this." Before Trip could crack a joke, the air exploded with motion. A swarm of crystal bats burst into the cavern, wings glinting like razors, their screeches bouncing off the walls in a deafening cacophony. "Oh, hell no!" Trip shouted, firing a gooey flare that splattered across the ceiling, raining sparks. The bats veered, but not fast enough. One slammed into Lyra, knocking her backward toward the pool. Instinct kicked in, and Trip lunged, his arms wrapping around her waist. His hands pressed hard into the curve of her hips, fingers digging into her pearlescent skin, firm yet impossibly smooth, like gripping a living gem. A surge of heat raced up his arms, her body vibrating under his touch, and he hauled her against his chest, breath ragged. "Gotcha, princess," he grunted, her scent, stardust and honey, flooding his senses. Lyra's wings flared, brushing his face with a silken rush of air, and she twisted in his grip, her starry gaze blazing. "Unhand me, fool," she snapped, but her voice hitched, betrayed by the way her body leaned into him for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Trip smirked, adrenaline pumping. "Yeah, sure, after we're not bat food." He shoved her behind a crystal spike, his palms sliding off her waist with a reluctant drag, the cool fire of her skin lingering on his fingertips. She glared, but there was no time to argue. The bats regrouped, diving again, their claws slashing at the air. Trip yanked a coil of emergency cable from his duffel, spinning it like a lasso. Time for some human ingenuity. He hurled it upward, snagging a jagged outcrop, and yanked hard, pulling down a chunk of ceiling. Crystal shards crashed onto the swarm, scattering them in a flurry of shrieks and glittering dust. Lyra watched, wings quivering, her lips parting slightly. "You fight well for a clumsy thing," she said almost grudgingly. Trip wiped sweat from his brow, grinning. "Clumsy's my middle name." "Well, that and doesn't die easy." The bats weren't done. A second wave surged in, bigger, their eyes glowing red through the haze. Trip's flare gun clicked empty, and he cursed, tossing it aside. Lyra stepped forward, wings humming a fierce melody, and raised her hands. The webbing between her fingers pulsed with light, sending a wave of sound that staggered the bats mid-flight. But it wasn't enough. One broke through, talons aimed at Trip's chest. He ducked, rolling toward Lyra, and crashed in her legs. His hands shot out, pressing against the backs of her thighs, fingers sliding up the taut, shimmering curves to steady himself. Her skin thrummed under his grip, a wild mix of cool silk and electric heat that made his stomach flip. He looked up, catching her starry eyes widen, a flush of light rippling across her chest. Nice legs," he stammered, voice hoarse. "Insolent," she started, but the bat swooped again, cutting her off. Trip shoved off her, scrambling to his feet, and grabbed a loose crystal shard. He swung like a bat, pun intended, cracking the creature's wing. It screeched, spiraling into the pool with a splash of glowing water. Lyra's wings snapped shut, her breath quickening as she stared at him. "You risk much," she said, softer now, stepping closer. Her hair floated toward him, brushing his cheek like a whisper of starlight. Trip's heart thudded, but he shrugged, playing it cool. "Risk's my game. Besides, you're worth it." She tilted her head, studying him, and for a moment, the chaos faded. "My kind shun me," she said, voice low raw. "They say my form, too soft, too human, is a flaw." Trip's grin faltered, something deeper flickering in his chest. He'd lost people too. His sister, gone in a colony collapse he couldn't stop. "Their loss," he said, stepping into her space, voice rough with honesty. "You're no flaw. You're a damn masterpiece." Her wings hummed faintly, a note of surprise, and she didn't pull back. The cavern shook again, a deeper rumble this time, not from the bats. Tripp's translator crackled, "Danger incoming, hot stuff?" And he groaned, smacking it. "Yeah, I got that." Lyra's gaze darted to the entrance, where shadows stretched longer, sharper. "Something else comes," she murmured, her hand brushing his arm, webbing cool against his sleeve. Tripp nodded, hefting the crystal shard, his shoulder bumping hers as they turned to face the dark. The air thickened, the hum of Astrolith pulsing like a heartbeat, and the glow from the pool flickered wildly, casting their silhouettes against the walls. The rumble in the cavern grew into a roar, and Tripp barely had time to blink before Lyra grabbed his wrist, her webbed fingers cool and firm against his skin. "Run, flesh thing," she barked, her wings snapping open with a chime that cut through the chaos. He didn't argue. Whatever was coming sounded big, and he'd already had enough near-death experiences for one day. They bolted from the pool, splashing through glowing water, and burst out into the neon grove just as the ground behind them cracked. A hulking shadow loomed through the trees. A starborn enforcer, Varys, his crystalline form jagged and dark, wings twice Lyra's span, radiating a low, menacing hum. "Traitor!" he bellowed, voice like shattering glass. "You defile us with this vermin." Tripp stumbled, cursing as a root snagged his boot, but Lyra yanked him forward, her strength surprising him. "Keep moving," she hissed, her starry eyes flashing. They sprinted toward a shimmering bridge of light stretching between their island and another floating chunk of Astrolith, its surface rippling like liquid starfire. Tripp's lungs burned, his suit creaking, but he couldn't help a wild grin. "Guess your exes don't like me," he shouted over the wind. Lyra's wings twitched, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face, but she didn't slow down. They hit the bridge, boots and bare feet pounding against its glowing span. It swayed under their weight, narrow and unstable, flanked by a drop into the endless void below. Tripp glanced back. Varys was closing in, his wings slicing the air, sending gusts that rocked the bridge. "Oh, come on," Tripp yelped, grabbing Lyra's hand tighter. His fingers slid along the webbing between her knuckles, the silken texture buzzing against his skin, sending a shiver up his arm. She shot him a glare, but her grip tightened too, pulling him along as the bridge trembled. Halfway across, Varys unleashed a blast of sound, a sonic wave that hit like a fist, splintering the light beneath them. The bridge buckled, chunks dissolving into sparks, and Tripp's stomach lurched as the floor dropped out. "Hold on," he roared, lunging for Lyra, his arms hooked around her waist, hands digging into the lush curve of her hips, fingers pressing deep into her pearlescent flesh. Her body was a paradox, soft yet unyielding, cool yet blazing with an inner heat that seared through his gloves. He yanked her against him, her chest slamming into his, and for a split second, their breaths mingled, her starry eyes inches from his. Her wings flared, catching the air, slowing their fall, and Tripp's heart slammed against his ribs, half from terror, half from the electric thrill of her press so close. "Fool!" she gasped, but her voice trembled, and her hands clutched his shoulders, webbing brushing his neck. They hit a lower fragment of the bridge, rolling in a tangle of limbs. Tripp landed on top, his hands still sliding along her sides, tracing the dip of her waist before he caught himself and scrambled up. "Sorry. Not sorry," he panted, offering a lopsided grin. Lyra pushed him off, wings humming furiously, but a flush of light danced across her skin, betraying her. "You test me," she muttered, hauling herself to her feet. Varys landed hard ahead of them, the bridge shuddering under his weight. "You cannot escape," he snarled, raising a clawed hand. Tripp didn't think. He grabbed Lyra's arm, yanking her behind him, and pulled his flare gun's backup canister from his belt. "Eat this, sparkle face," he shouted, hurling it. The canister exploded midair, a blinding burst of orange flame and smoke, and Varys recoiled, wings shielding his face. Trip hooped, fist-pumping. "Human ingenuity, baby." Lyra stared, her lips twitching like she might be impressed. But the bridge wasn't done with them. A crack split the light beneath their feet, and Trip shoved Lyra forward as it collapsed. They leapt to the next island, a jagged slab of rock fringed with neon trees, landing in a heap. Trip's hand shot out, pressing against the small of her back to steady her, fingers sliding up the smooth arch of her spine. Her skin thrummed under his touch, a pulse of warmth that made his throat tighten, and she arched slightly, wings quivering. "You good?" he asked, voice rough, his palm lingering a beat too long. She turned, starry eyes locking onto his, breath quick. "You are reckless," she said, but her tone softened, almost a whisper. Varys roared from above, diving through the smoke, and Trip cursed, dragging Lyra into the trees. "Reckless is my specialty," he shot back, weaving through glowing trunks. The forest pulsed around them, vines snapping like whips, and a new sound joined the chase. A deep, slithering hiss from the undergrowth. Trip tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb brushing the webbing again, and she didn't pull away. The neon leaves rustled, casting wild shadows, and Varys' wings beat closer, a dark silhouette against the starry void. Trip's flare gun was spent, but he rummaged in his duffel, fingers closing on a spare battery pack, mind racing for a plan as they ducked under a glowing canopy. Trip yanked Lyra deeper into the neon forest, his boots skidding on slick, glowing moss as the slithering hiss grew louder behind them. The canopy overhead pulsed with electric blues and pinks, casting wild shadows that danced across her pearlescent skin. Varys' wings beat somewhere above, a relentless drum against the hum of Astrolith. But the trees were thick here, buying them a sliver of time. Trip's hand still gripped hers, his thumb brushing the silken webbing between her fingers, and he felt her pulse, a faint, alien rhythm that quickened under his touch. "Keep up, Stargirl," he panted, dodging a snapping vine that lashed out like a whip. Lyra's wings hummed, a sharp note of frustration, but she matched his pace, her hair floating behind her like a comet's tail. "This way," she hissed, veering toward a narrow crevice between two towering rocks. Trip followed, squeezing through, his suit scraping against jagged edges. The gap opened into a hidden hollow, and he stumbled to a stop, breath catching. A pool of glowing liquid shimmered at the center, its surface swirling with colors like a trapped nebula, purples, golds, blues blending into each other. Mist rose in delicate tendrils, and the air felt thick, alive, vibrating with a soft, hypnotic song. "Whoa," Trip muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Your planet's got a knack for pretty." Lyra stepped toward the pool, her wings trembling faintly. "This is a sacred place," she said, voice low, almost reverent. "It holds the echoes of our power." She knelt by the edge, dipping her webbed fingers into the water, and a ripple of light spread outward, illuminating her curves in a way that made Trip's throat go dry. He shook his head, refocusing. Varys wasn't far behind, and that slithering thing was still out there. He rummaged in his duffel, pulling out the battery pack, and started rigging it to a coil of wire. "Gonna make us a little surprise," he said, grinning. "Humans love a good boom." A shadow passed overhead. Varys, circling like a vulture. Lyra's head snapped up, her starry eyes narrowing. But before she could speak, the ground shuddered. A massive crystal serpent erupted from the undergrowth, its scales glinting like shattered mirrors, eyes burning red. It reared, fangs dripping with neon venom, and lunged. Trip shoved Lyra aside, his hands pressing hard into her waist, fingers digging into the lush dip above her hips. Her skin thrummed under his grip, a wild pulse of cool fire that shot through his arms, and she gasped, wings flaring wide. "Move!" he yelled, rolling with her as the serpent's jaws snapped shut inches from their heads. They hit the ground near the pool, Trip's chest heaving as he scrambled up. The serpent hissed, coiling for another strike, and Lyra's wings faltered, their hum weakening. "He's severed me," she whispered, clutching her side where a faint crack marred her pearlescent skin. "My link to Astrolith, it's fading." Tripp's gut twisted. Anger, fear, something fiercer. "Not on my watch," he growled, grabbing his makeshift bomb. He hurled it, the battery sparking as it struck the serpent's flank. A flash of light and a deafening crack split the air, sending the beast reeling, scales raining down like glass. But Varys descended, wings slicing through the mist, his sonic blast ripping across the hollow. The pool churned, waves crashing, and Lyra staggered, collapsing to her knees. Tripp dove for her, arms wrapping around her torso. His hands slid up her sides, fingers pressing into the soft swell beneath her chest, tracing the curve with a desperate strength. Her body trembled against him, warm and alive despite the fading light in her wings, and he pulled her close, his breath hot against her ear. "I've got you," he rasped, voice thick with strain, the feel of her, so solid, so fragile, igniting a fire in his chest. She leaned into him, starry eyes dimming, and murmured, "You cannot hold me forever." "Want to bet?" He shot back, half a laugh, half a vow. He dragged her toward the pool, her weight sagging in his arms. The water glowed brighter as they neared, and he lowered her in, his hands digging into her hips to steady her. The liquid lapped at her skin, seeping into the crack, and her wings twitched, a faint hum returning. Tripp's suit beeped, oxygen low, and he ignored it, ripping off his reserve tube. He pressed it to her lips, fingers brushing her jaw, and forced the air into her. "Breathe, damn it," he muttered, his own lungs burning. Her eyes fluttered, locking onto his, and she gripped his wrist, webbing cool against his skin. Varys landed hard, the hollow shaking, and Tripp swayed, vision blurring. The serpent slithered back, wounded but alive, its hiss mingling with Varys' roar. "You will drown in your folly," the Starborn bellowed, raising a clawed hand. Tripp slumped beside Lyra, his hand still on her hip, fingers sliding along the wet curve as he fought to stay conscious. She stirred, wings humming louder, and pushed herself up, water cascading off her in shimmering streams. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice steel wrapped in silk, and Tripp managed a weak grin, his head lolling against her shoulder. The mist thickened, curling around them like a shield, and Varys' shadow loomed closer, his sonic waves pulsing through the air. Lyra's hand tightened on Tripp's, her webbing brushing his knuckles, and she pulled him deeper into the pool, the glowing water rising to their waists. The serpent circled, scales glinting, and Tripp's fingers fumbled for anything left in his duffel, his breath shallow but stubborn. The glowing water of the nebula pool lapped at Tripp's waist, his boots sinking into the soft silt as he steadied Lyra against him. Her wings hummed stronger now, a defiant melody cutting through the mist, and her starry eyes blazed with renewed fire. Varys loomed at the hollow's edge, his jagged form radiating a low, guttural hum, while the crystal serpent slithered closer, its scales scraping the rock with a sound like breaking glass. Tripp's chest burned, oxygen starvation clawing at his lungs, but he forced a grin, his hand still pressing against Lyra's hip, fingers sliding along the wet curve where her skin met the water. "Round two, huh?" he rasped, voice rough but unbroken. She glanced at him, her hair floating like a halo, and nodded, gripping his wrist with a webbed hand. "We take the fight to them," she said, her tone sharp as a blade. "The citadel, my power lies there." Tripp didn't hesitate. He hauled himself out of the pool, water streaming off his battered suit, and pulled her up after him. His hands dug into her waist, lifting her with a grunt, the slick heat of her body pulsing under his palms, sending a jolt up his spine. She landed gracefully, wings flaring, and he stumbled, catching himself against her shoulder. "Lead the way, Stargirl," he panted, shaking off the dizziness. Varys roared, unleashing a sonic blast that shattered the pool's edge, and the serpent lunged, forcing them to dive behind a glowing boulder. Tripp rummaged in his duffel, fingers closing on a cracked grav glove, one last trick up his sleeve. "Gotta get creative," he muttered, slapping onto his hand. Lyra grabbed his arm, pulling him toward a narrow path winding upward through the neon forest. "The citadel floats above," she said, her wings brushing his side as they ran. The trees pulsed faster, reacting to Varys' pursuit, and the ground trembled under the serpent's weight. Trip glanced back. Varys' wings beat the air, closing the gap, his claws glinting like obsidian knives. "Faster!" Trip shouted, shoving Lyra ahead, his hands sliding along her lower back, fingers tracing the arch of her spine. Her skin thrummed, a wild vibration that made his pulse race, and she shot him a look, half warning, half something else. The path opened onto a cliff, and there it was, the Starborn Citadel, a fortress of crystalline spires floating on a massive island in the void, its edges glowing with veins of starlight. Bridges of shimmering light connected it to the forest, swaying like threads in the wind. Trip whistled, impressed despite the chaos. "Fancy digs." Lyra didn't pause. She leapt onto the nearest bridge, her wings catching the air, and Trip followed, boots pounding the unstable surface. The bridge rocked, and he grabbed her hand, fingers pressing into the webbing between her knuckles, the silken buzz igniting his nerves. "Don't let me fall," he yelled, half joking, but her grip tightened, pulling him along. Varys landed behind them, his sonic wave splintering the bridge's end. Trip spun, activating the grav glove, and aimed it at a neon tree on the cliff. A pulse of force yanked the trunk free, hurling it into Varys' path. The Starborn snarled, slashing it apart, but it bought them seconds. "Human tricks," he bellowed, diving after them. The serpent slithered onto the bridge, its weight cracking the light, and Trip cursed, dragging Lyra faster. "We're gonna need a bigger boom," he shouted, rummaging one-handed in his bag for anything explosive. They reached the citadel's edge, a platform of smooth crystal ringed by towering spires. Lyra knelt, pressing her hands to the floor, and a pulse of light rippled outward, her wings humming a fierce song. "I can feel it," she whispered. "My strength, it's here." Trip stood over her, grav glove humming, as Varys crashed onto the platform, his claws gouging the surface. "You'll feel nothing but death," he roared, raising a hand. Trip didn't think. He tackled Lyra out of the way, his arms wrapping around her torso. His hands dug into her sides, fingers sliding up the lush curve beneath her chest, pressing her against him as they rolled. Her body was electric, warm, trembling, alive, and he felt her breath hitch, her wings brushing his face with a rush of silken air. "Stay with me," he growled, pinning her beneath him for a heartbeat before scrambling up. Varys' sonic blast hit where they'd been, cracking the crystal, and Trip shoved Lyra toward Spire. "Go now," he yelled, turning to face the Starborn. He raised the grav glove, firing a pulse that staggered Varys, but the serpent lunged from the side, fangs bared. Trip dodged, the venom grazing his suit, sizzling through the fabric. Pain seared his arm, and he stumbled, blood dripping onto the crystal. Lyra spun, wings flaring, and unleashed a wave of sound that drove the serpent back, but her light flickered. She was still weak. "Trip," she called, her voice raw, and he forced himself up, grinning through the pain. "Can't get rid of me that easy." Varys advanced, his hum growing deafening, and Trip grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her into the Citadel's core, a vast chamber of glowing walls and floating shards. She pointed to a pulsing orb at the center, its light matching her wings. "There," she said, staggering forward. Trip supported her, his hand pressing in her lower back, fingers digging into the soft dip above her hips, steadying her as she swayed. Her warmth bled through his glove, a desperate lifeline, and he leaned close, breath hot against her ear. "We're getting you that power," he murmured, voice thick with resolve. She nodded, leaning into him, and they stumbled toward the orb as Varys' shadow filled the doorway, his claws scraping the threshold. The serpent slithered in behind, its hiss echoing and Trip tightened his grip on the grav glove, his injured arm throbbing. Lyra's wings hummed louder, syncing with the orb, and the chamber pulsed, light dancing across her skin. Varys raised both hands, sonic waves building, and Trip shoved Lyra forward, his boots sliding on the crystal floor as he braced for the next move. Trip's boots skidded across the crystal floor as Varys' sonic waves slammed into the chamber, a wall of sound that rattled his teeth and sent shards of light spiraling from the walls. He shoved Lyra toward the glowing orb, his hands still pressing into the small of her back, fingers digging into the soft, warm dip above her hips. Her skin pulsed under his touch, a wild rhythm that synced with the orb's light, and he felt her tremble, strength returning, but not fast enough. The serpent's hiss echoed behind them, its coils scraping the floor, and Varys' shadow loomed larger, his wings beating a storm into the air. "You're mine, traitor!" he roared, claws flexing as the hum built to a deafening pitch. Trip spun, raising the grav glove with his good arm, the other hanging limp, blood seeping from the venom burn. "Not today, Sparkle Face!" he shouted, firing a pulse that warped the air, knocking Varys back a step. The Starborn snarled, slashing the force aside, and the serpent lunged, fangs glinting. Trip dove, tackling Lyra out of its path. They hit the ground hard, his chest slamming against hers, hands sliding up her sides, fingers pressing into the lush curve beneath her chest. Her body was electric, firm yet yielding, a surge of heat and vibration that made his breath catch, her wings flaring wide beneath him. She gasped, starry eyes locking onto his, and for a heartbeat, the chaos faded, her warmth searing through his torn suit. "You're heavy," she hissed, but her webbed hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him closer. "Flattering," he grunted, rolling off her, his palms lingering on her waist a beat too long. The serpent's tail whipped toward them, and Trip yanked her up, his hand digging into her hip, steadying her as she swayed. "Get to that orb," he barked, shoving her forward. She stumbled, wings humming a fierce melody, and reached the pedestal, her fingers brushing the glowing sphere. Light flared, flooding the chamber, and her skin blazed, cracks healing as her power surged back. Trip hooped, fist pumping despite the pain. "That's my girl." But Varys wasn't done. He unleashed a sonic blast that cracked the floor, sending Trip staggering, blood dripping faster from his arm. The serpent coiled around a spire, striking again, and Lyra spun, her wings unleashing a wave of sound that staggered at mid-lunge. Trip saw his chance. Grabbing a jagged shard from the floor, he charged Varys, swinging with everything he had. The crystal grazed the Starborn's wing, shattering a piece, and Varys roared, backhanding Trip across the chamber. He crashed into a wall, suit sparking, and slid down, vision swimming. Lyra's cry cut through the haze. "Trip!" Raw and desperate, and she rushed to him, wings flaring protectively. Her hands grabbed his shoulders, webbing cool against his neck, and she hauled him up, her strength amplified by the orb. "You idiot," she snapped, but her starry eyes shimmered, wet with something unspoken. Trip grinned weakly, blood smearing his chin. "Yeah, but I'm your idiot." He leaned into her, his hands sliding along her lower back, fingers pressing into the taut curve above her hips, anchoring himself. Her breath hitched, wings quivering, and she held him tighter, her warmth a lifeline against the pain. Varys advanced, his hum shaking the walls, and the serpent slithered closer, eyes burning red. "Enough," the Starborn bellowed, raising both hands. "I'll end you both." Trip's suit beeped, systems failing, and he coughed, tasting copper. "Not yet," he rasped, fumbling with the grav glove. He aimed it at the ceiling, where a massive crystal hung, and fired. The pulse yanked it free, sending it crashing down toward Varys. The Starborn dodged, but the impact shook the chamber, dust and light exploding outward. Lyra pulled Trip behind the orb's pedestal, her body shielding his, and he pressed against her, his hands digging into her waist, fingers sliding up the smooth arch of her spine. Her skin thrummed under his touch, a desperate pulse that matched his racing heart, and he buried his face in her hair, breathing in stardust and honey. "We're not dying here," he murmured, voice thick, raw. She turned, starry eyes fierce, and nodded. "Together," she said, her voice steel wrapped in silk. She stepped toward Varys, wings blazing, and Trip staggered after her, grav glove sparking. The serpent lunged, and Lyra met it with a sonic wave, shattering its scales, but Varys countered, his blast knocking her back. Trip caught her, arms wrapping around her torso, hands pressing hard into her sides, fingers tracing the curve of her ribs. Her body trembled against him, warm and alive, and he held her up, breath ragged. "I've got you," he growled, defiance burning through the pain. Varys laughed a cold, jagged sound and raised his claws. "Your bond is your weakness," he snarled, unleashing a sonic pulse that cracked the orb's pedestal. Lyra swayed, light flickering, and Trip tightened his grip, his injured arm screaming. He rummaged in his duffel with his free hand, pulling out a cracked flare canister, his last shot. "Weakness, huh?" he muttered, rigging it to the grav glove. He fired, the canister arcing toward Varys, exploding in a blinding flash of orange and smoke. The Starborn recoiled, wings shielding his face, and the serpent hissed, disoriented. Lyra seized the moment, rushing to the orb, her wings humming a song of fury. She slammed her hands onto it, light flooding her form, and Trip stumbled after her, blood dripping onto the crystal floor. Varys emerged from the smoke, his hum growing louder, and the chamber pulsed, walls trembling as the orb's energy surged. Lyra's hair floated wildly, her skin blazing, and Trip braced himself beside her, his hand brushing her arm, webbing cool against his skin as the air crackled with power. The chamber shuddered as Lyra's hands pressed against the orb, its light surging into her, igniting her wings with a brilliance that turned the air to fire. Trip braced himself beside her, blood dripping from his arm onto the crystal floor, the flare's smoke still curling around Varys' towering form. The Starborn emerged, wings beating through the haze, his hum a thunderous roar that cracked the walls. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, claws flexing as the serpent slithered to his side, its shattered scales glinting red. Lyra's starry eyes blazed, her voice cutting through the din. "It changes everything." She stepped forward, wings humming a song of defiance, and Trip staggered after her, his grav glove sparking faintly. Varys unleashed a sonic blast, a wall of sound that slammed into them. Trip grabbed Lyra's arm, yanking her down as the wave shattered a spire behind them. They hit the floor, his body shielding hers, hands sliding along her sides, fingers pressing into the lush curve beneath her chest. Her skin thrummed under his touch, a wild pulse of heat and light that made his breath hitch, her wings brushing his face with a rush of silken air. "Stay down," he growled, pinning her for a heartbeat, her warmth searing through his torn suit. She twisted beneath him, starry eyes fierce, and shoved him off, her webbed hands gripping his shoulders. "I fight with you," she hissed, pulling him up as the serpent lunged. Trip rolled aside, the fangs missing him by inches, and scrambled to his feet. Lyra met the beast with a sonic wave, her wings flaring, shattering more of its scales. Trip rummaged in his duffel, pulling out a cracked harmonic beacon, his last human trick, a device meant to calm storms. "Time to improvise," he muttered, rigging it with the grav glove's battery. Varys advanced, his hum shaking the orb, and Trip shouted, "Lyra, the core." She nodded, darting toward a glowing fissure in the chamber's center. Astrolith's heart, a massive crystal pulsing with the planet's life. The serpent coiled, striking again, and tripped of, tackling Lyra out of its path. They crashed near the fissure, his arms wrapping around her torso, hands digging in her waist, fingers sliding up the smooth arch of her spine. Her body trembled against him, firm yet fragile, a surge of electric heat that made his pulse race, and he pressed her close, breath hot against her ear. "You're not dying on me," he rasped, voice thick with strain, her stardust scent flooding his senses. She clutched his shoulders, wings quivering, and whispered, "Nor you." Her webbing brushed his neck, cool and desperate, as they scrambled up. Varys roared, his sonic blast cracking the fissure's edge, and the core pulsed wildly, vines of light lashing out. One wrapped Trip's leg, yanking him down, and his suit sparked, systems failing. Lyra spun, her wings unleashing a sound wave that severed the vine, but Varys countered, his hum staggering her. She fell, light flickering, and Trip crawled to her, blood smearing the crystal. "Hang on," he yelled, his hands pressing hard into her hips, lifting her against him. Her skin blazed under his grip, a fire that burned through his gloves, and he pulled her close, fingers digging in her curves, steadying her as she swayed. Her starry eyes locked onto his, raw and unshaken, and she nodded, leaning into his strength. Trip shoved the beacon into the fissure, its hum clashing with Varys's. "Work, damn it," he growled, slamming the grav glove against it. A pulse erupted, rippling through the core, and the vines recoiled, the chamber trembling. Varys snarled, diving forward, and Lyra met him, her wings blazing as she unleashed a sonic wave that staggered him mid-flight. The serpent lunged, and Trip rolled, grabbing a shard to stab its eye, blood and venom splattering his suit. He collapsed, chest heaving, and Lyra rushed to him, her hands gripping his arms, pulling him up. "You're bleeding," she said, voice breaking, her webbing cool against his skin. "Worth it," he coughed, grinning weakly. Varys recovered, his hum building to a deafening crescendo, and the core pulsed faster, light flooding the chamber. "You'll destroy us all," he bellowed, raising his claws. Trip tightened his grip on Lyra, his hands sliding along her lower back, fingers pressing into the taut dip above her hips, anchoring her to him. "Not if we stop you," he muttered, defiance burning through the pain. The beacon's hum grew, syncing with Lyra's wings, and she stepped forward, her light blazing brighter, her hair floating wildly. The serpent hissed, circling them, and Varys unleashed a final sonic blast, cracking the core surface. Trip shoved Lyra aside, taking the brunt, and his suit shorted out, oxygen hissing free. He gasped, vision blurring, and Lyra caught him, her arms wrapping around his chest, wings shielding him. "No," she cried, her voice raw, desperate, and she pressed her hands to the core, amplifying the beacon's pulse. The chamber shook, vines thrashing, and Trip slumped against her, his hand brushing her thigh, fingers trembling as he fought to stay conscious. The light surged, swallowing Varys' shadow, and the serpent recoiled, scales shattering, as the core's hum drowned out the chaos. Lyra held Trip tight, her warmth a lifeline, and the chamber pulsed, walls glowing with Astrolith's fury. Varys staggered, wings faltering, and the beacon's sound rippled outward, vines curling toward him as the fight raged on. The core's light flared, a blinding cascade that swallowed Varys' shadow as Lyra clung to Trip, her wings shielding him from the chaos. His suit hissed, oxygen gone, and his chest heaved, each breath a ragged fight against the dark creeping into his vision. The beacon's hum pulsed through Astrolith's heart, vines of light thrashing wildly, and Varys staggered, his sonic roar faltering under the overwhelming sound. The serpent hissed, its shattered form coiling in retreat, but Lyra's grip tightened, her web hands pressing into Trip's shoulders, her warmth a desperate anchor. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice trembling, her starry eyes blazing through the haze. Trip forced a grin, blood smearing his lips. "Not going anywhere," he rasped, his hand sliding along her thigh, fingers digging into the firm curve as he pulled himself upright. Her skin thrummed under his touch, a surge of electric heat that jolted his fading senses awake, and he leaned into her, breath hot against her neck. The chamber shook, the core's vines lashing toward Varys, wrapping his legs, and he roared, slashing them apart. Trip coughed, shoving the last of his strength into his legs, and stumbled forward, dragging Lyra with him. "Finish it," he growled, his hand pressing in her lower back, fingers tracing the taut dip above her hips, urging her on. Lyra nodded, her wings flaring wide, humming a song that synced with the beacon's pulse. She slammed her hands onto the core, light flooding her form, and the vines surged, faster, stronger, ensnaring Varys' wings. "No!" he bellowed, his hum cracking as the tendrils tightened, pulling him down. Trip grabbed a jagged shard, lunging with a guttural yell, and drove it into Varys' chest. The Starborn's light dimmed, his claws raking the air, and the serpent lunged one last time, fangs bared. Lyra spun, her sonic wave shattering its skull, scales raining down like glass, and it collapsed, lifeless, at the core's edge. The chamber stilled, the core's pulse slowing, and Trip slumped against Lyra, his legs giving out. She caught him, arms wrapping around his chest, her wings folding around them like a shield. His hands slid up her sides, fingers pressing into the lush curve beneath her chest, clinging to her as his vision swam. Her body trembled against him, warm and alive, and she pressed her forehead to his, her stardust scent enveloping him. "You're safe," she murmured, voice soft, raw, her webbing brushing his jaw. He managed a weak laugh, breath shallow. "Told you, I'd fix this." The core's light softened, Astrolith's hum settling into a gentle rhythm, and the vines retreated, leaving Varys' broken form lifeless on the crystal floor. Lyra held Trip tighter, her wings humming a quiet melody, and the chamber glowed with a new warmth. She pulled him to his feet, her strength steadying him, and they stepped out onto the citadel's platform. The sky above shimmered, bridges of light reforming, neon forests pulsing with life. The Starborn emerged from the spires, their wings humming softly, and bowed, not to Lyra alone, but to them both. "You've saved us," one said, voice like chiming bells, and Trip grinned, leaning on Lyra. Team effort. Days later, Astrolith bloomed anew. Floating islands stabilized, forests glowed brighter, and the air sang with harmony. The Starborn welcomed Lyra back, their exile forgotten, and offered Trip a place among them. He scratched his scruffy jaw, glancing at her. "Only if I get to build something stupid." She laughed, a sound like starlight, and together they crafted a home, a dome of crystal and human tech, perched on a cliff overlooking the void. Its walls shimmered with her light, its frame sturdy with his ingenuity, a perfect blend of their worlds. That night, under a sky ablaze with triple suns, Trip pulled Lyra close on the dome's balcony. His hands dug into her waist, fingers sliding up the smooth arch of her spine, pressing her against him with a hunger he'd held back too long. Her skin blazed under his touch, a fire that raced through his veins, and she arched into him, wings quivering as his breath grazed her neck. "You're my home," he murmured, voice thick with emotion, his lips brushing her ear, sending a shiver through her. Her starry eyes softened, her hands gripping his shoulders, webbing cool against his skin. "And you're my star," she replied, her voice a purr that echoed in his chest. He kissed her neck, slow and deliberate, his hands pressing harder into her curves, tracing the lush dip of her hips, savoring the electric thrill of her trembling beneath him. She gasped, wings flaring wide, and pulled him closer, her warmth enveloping him in a way that felt like victory, like peace. They sank onto a bench, tangled together, laughing as Trip nearly tipped them over, his goofy grin lighting her starry gaze. "Still clumsy," she teased, and he smirked, "Only for you." The suns dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over their home, and the Starborn gathered below, their wings humming a song of unity. Trip and Lyra stood, hand in hand, watching the bridges shimmer across the void. He'd lost so much, his sister, his old life, but here with her he'd found more. She leaned into him, her hair floating like a nebula, and he squeezed her hand, feeling the webbing pulse with her heartbeat. The planet thrummed beneath them, alive and whole, and Trip chuckled, muttering, "Guess we're not so bad at this hero thing." Lyra's wings brushed his back, a silent promise, and they turned back to their dome, stepping inside as the night deepened. The door slid shut, the hum of Astrolith fading to a whisper, and Trip pulled her into one last embrace, his hands resting on her hips, fingers tracing her curves with a quiet reverence. The stars outside blazed, a testament to their triumph, and the world they'd built together glowed on, a beacon of misfit love in the endless void.